What is up, you beautiful people? Matt Walsh has something to say about Midwest tornadoes and climate change. Stupid old man, let's put him in his place.
Living as we did up in the woods in Pennsylvania before we moved out to Nashville, we never had to think much about, tornadoes.
We're going to skip this stupid story because nobody cares.
There's a sickening sort of helplessness that you feel when you're in the path of something like this. We had just a very, very small taste of that.
Okay, so to summarize, he's talking about the recent tornado outbreak last week that ripped through parts of the Midwestern and Southern United States. You've probably seen it in the news recently. The one thing I will agree with Walsh here is that it was truly a horrifying event, especially if you see the aftermath of all the destruction it caused. I couldn't even imagine what I would do if I were caught in the middle of something like this. Now, the harsh reality of this is that tornadoes happen a lot more often than you may think. You see this on the news once and you probably thought it was just one tornado. It's not. A cluster of tornadoes formed from the same supercell thunderstorm. And even if we're not just talking about the single event, tornadoes happen all the time. You just don't really hear about them that often. Many of them just cause minor damage, but many of them still do completely destroy buildings. So this tornado that ripped through Kentucky that you've heard about on the news, it's not the only one. It was just more famous because it was such a strong tornado. In the US alone, you should actually expect a couple hundred every year. Most, of course, hitting the Midwest areas. Anyway, let's continue.
Because you know that you're at the mercy of nature, and if things decide to hit directly where you're sitting, no matter how many precautions you take, you're probably doomed. When you consider the force and the magnitude and the boundlessness of nature, it becomes all the more not only grotesque, but absurd after the fact when the political forces in our country attempt to turn these natural forces into a political issue. But that's exactly what happened here, as usual.
In case you haven't connected the dots already, he's talking about climate change. Okay, so what I hear so far is a weak argument wrapped up in pretty words. Sure, in front of you, you see a great force of nature, but that doesn't mean events like this aren't a result of our actions. You essentially just said, this thing looks like it's out of our control, so it probably is. A weak argument not based on scientific concepts, I must say. The thing is, for the average person, it's incredibly difficult to see the connection between two events if they're not directly related. Because for something like climate change, it causes a lot of effects on our climate and weather indirectly, and you can't really say if a specific natural disaster could have been avoided if we didn't emit CO2 into the atmosphere. But of course, talking about specifics is usually not what is presented. We know that certain weather events and disasters, such as hurricanes, increases significantly in frequency and intensity due to climate change. Tornadoes is a bit of a trickier concept, so let's go over that in a bit.
With bodies still buried under the rubble, the media and politicians set out to make ideological hay out of the whole thing by tying the tornadoes to, of course, climate change and claiming that we could have somehow prevented Saturday's disaster through well-written legislation.
If anyone said that we could have prevented specifically this cluster of tornadoes, then that is silly. But rather, what I see are people saying that this is a wake-up sign that we need to start doing something about climate change in a general sense. But of course, we have extremes on both ends. Just like how we have dumb people who blindly denies climate change on one side, we also have alarmists who take it too far. Now, don't get me wrong, these alarmist ideas, so to say, are still much more compatible with science in a general sense than people who either deny anthropogenic climate change or people who believe in it but don't think we should do anything about it. That being said, yes, it does seem like whenever a disaster related to weather hits the United States, the whole debate of climate change rekindles itself, which in my opinion is kind of silly. We shouldn't just be talking about climate change when we're hit by a tornado or hurricane. We should always be talking about climate change. It's already constantly hurting so many people in the world, especially third world countries, but only when it comes back and hits us are we reminded that this is an issue. That's like you spilling water on the floor and 100 people slip on it and hurt themselves. But it's only when you yourself step on the water and fall do you then think, maybe I should clean this up. Of course, no one is saying the process is going to be easy, but the first step to solving a problem is going to be recognizing it first. And when half the country doesn't believe in man-made global warming, people who write our laws and legislation, it seems like a problem we're never going to seriously tackle.
Yes, we know that the climate change caused this. I can't say how or to what extent or offer any proof, but just go with my general statements anyway. We don't know how, but it happened.
Dude, why do you just assume people don't know how the science works? Kind of a stupid assumption, don't you think? Here's the thing, a lot of people can indeed misrepresent what the science says. You know what you should do when that happens? Yep, instead of assuming there is no science there, how about you actually go educate yourself and read some scientific literature? I guarantee the vast majority of climate change skeptics haven't even read a single science paper, much less a paper on climate change. Okay, so now that we're on this topic, let's go over tornadoes and its relationship with global warming. Now, the story on tornadoes is indeed more complicated. It's not like hurricanes or wildfires where we know it significantly increases in frequency as the planet gets warmer. Tornadoes are tricky because of the conditions that form them. Now, there are many different types of tornadoes, but most that fits into our classic definition are caused by the presence of supercells. You can think of a supercell as a thunderstorm, and these charges in the air creates a series of rotating motion called mesocyclones. Normally, these mesocyclones stay in the sky, but heavy rainfall can pull it downwards towards the surface. The inhalation of cold air at this point, contrasting the warmer air above, creates a downwards pressure that pulls the rotating winds onto the surface of the Earth. That's a very, very shortened explanation on how tornadoes are formed. Of course, depending on the weather conditions, you can have varying intensities. Okay, so how does this relate to climate change and global warming? Scientists haven't drawn an exact conclusion, and like I mentioned before, it's not nearly as clear-cut as other natural disasters, but we have some ideas and a few hypotheses. For one, supercells that form in the sky are likely supported by weather conditions promoted by increased temperatures. Warm and moist air are ideal conditions for creating these charged cells, which is promoted by an increased evaporation from various water sources on the surface, such as warmer seas. More supercells means more mesocyclones, increasing the chances of a tornado family forming. In fact, many of the tornadoes across the Midwest United States are caused because of warmer air from the Gulf of Mexico, evaporating into the air and traveling northwards. Now, of course, just because we have the concept does not necessarily mean there's a connection in reality. Right now, we don't have enough evidence to say climate change increases the frequency of tornadoes, but rather potentially affects their behavior. Each tornado is its own beast, so it's difficult to evaluate them as a whole and give a yes or no answer to climate change worsening them. Basically, what I'm saying is, we have sound scientific concepts that say yes to a connection between tornadoes and climate change, but we don't have sufficient data evidence yet. More research needs to be done, and we need to see some more papers published on the topic of tornadoes. That being said, I can already hear the climate change skeptics jumping for joy, saying, "See, there's no connection between climate change and tornadoes." But that's actually not the case. Having insufficient data or evidence does not mean there isn't a causation. It just means more work needs to be done. And don't forget that tornadoes aren't the only natural disaster in the world. We still have forest fires, hurricanes, and droughts, which we do know has a relationship with anthropogenic climate change.
Actor Mark Ruffalo, last seen using cutesy pet names for child rapists in Kenosha, was more direct, tweeting, quote, "This is what hashtag climate catastrophe looks like. It's only going to get worse from here. Now it's time to fight for our suffering and despairing youth."
So Matt here proceeds to read some tweets from climate alarmists, I guess. Some of them do make absolute claims. That's what I mean about people being on both sides. You have people making extreme claims about climate change even if the science isn't there yet, which is why I always urge people to read the science. It just absolutely baffles me when you have people debating about a topic that they have no education on. Why is it that people tend to go after other people on the opposite side of the political spectrum when instead you could all just take a step back and talk to climate scientists who actually know what the hell they're talking about? Climate alarmists who go too far are only making a bad case. When you make such extreme claims that aren't based on science, you're giving the skeptics ammo, ones that they can use not only against you, but also against the scientific community. So please, don't go out saying that climate change causes tornadoes, at least not now. If you want to do that for forest fires, then go for it. You have scientific backing. But tornadoes? Let's leave that as it is for now. We need to be honest and we need to be scientific if we want to convince these stupid climate change skeptics.
The consensus from all of these sources is that natural disasters like tornadoes happen because of us.
First of all, many natural disasters do have clear links to climate change. Tornadoes just happens to be more on the fuzzy side. Second of all, natural disasters don't happen because of us, but many of them do increase in frequency and intensity because of us. Don't get that mixed up.
Now, let's be clear about something here. That view, to the extent that it's held sincerely, is straight up superstition. Okay, it's on the level of like a primitive tribesman who thinks that he can stop the rain or make the rain start or whatever, influence the weather by dancing around a fire and chanting certain things. In fact, it's worse than that. It's far worse than that, because at least the primitive tribesman has an excuse to be ignorant of the science.
That's pretty golden coming from you, claiming other people are ignorant of the science. Just to let you know, science in no way, shape, or form supports your position, you man-child.
Now, here are some facts to keep in mind on the issue of climate change and how it affects tornadoes. First of all, if natural disasters were getting deadlier, there would be a very obvious reason for that, which has nothing to do with climate change. There are more people on Earth, so a deadlier catastrophe is one, right, that kills more people. And if there are more people around, then that means that more people can die, because more people will be in the path of any given disaster.
What kind of idiot thinks that natural disaster intensity is measured by the number of people that die? No, we have objective measurements for things like this. For earthquakes, we have magnitude. For hurricanes, we have the wind scale. For droughts, we have the PDSI. And for tornadoes, we have the EF scale. And what we see recently are more intense disasters. Stronger hurricanes and storms, longer droughts, more frequent forest fires, and yes, even more intense tornadoes. This guy legit sitting here thinking we measure natural disaster intensity by the number of deaths.
Yet, amazingly, what you find is that, in fact, a lot fewer people are actually dying in this way. Natural disaster deaths are at historic lows, not highs, in spite of the fact that there are so many more people around.
That's actually completely misleading. Yes, the number of natural disaster deaths have decreased, but you forgot to mention that the amount of capital damage has increased. The reason deaths have decreased is due to better technology, better warning systems, and better response programs, which saves a lot of lives, not because the storms are getting less intense. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Anyway, that'll be the end of today's video. Thank you to my patrons. You already know who they are: Fireshard, Alan Morton, and Miss Fixit. I hope you all have fun over the holidays, but make sure to stay safe. Bye-bye.